October 10th, 2025. The morning began like any other in Ouagadougou. Sun-baked streets stretched beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Motorbikes hummed past the high walls of the United States Embassy, weaving through traffic with the kind of practiced chaos that makes West African cities feel alive. And outside those walls, a line of people waited. They clutched folders. Some had documents organized with the precision of desperation: passports, bank statements, invitation letters, proof of ties to home. Others held worn notebooks where they had rehearsed answers to questions they hoped would determine their futures. Students dreaming of scholarships, entrepreneurs seeking partnerships, families hoping to visit relatives they had not seen in years. For many in that queue, today was supposed to be the day their lives changed. The day a visa stamp opened a door that had always seemed locked. The day opportunity stopped being a distant concept and became a plane ticket in their hands. Then, at 9:47 in the morning, everything stopped. A single paragraph appeared on the embassy's digital notice board. No preamble, no explanation. Just 12 words that carried the weight of a diplomatic earthquake. All routine visa services are suspended until further notice. No context, no apology, no timeline for when normal operations might resume. Just silence from the country that never misses a chance to preach transparency. Within an hour, the queue had dissolved. By noon, the story had consumed the city. And by evening, the world would learn what happened when a small African nation looked a superpower in the eye and said no. This is not just a story about visas. It is a story about dignity refusing to bend, about power being redefined, about what happens when sovereignty stops being a slogan and becomes a policy backed by consequences. If this resonates with you, if you believe that African nations have the right to stand on their own terms, give us your like, leave your thoughts, and subscribe. Because what you are about to hear is not just news, it is a shift in the global order happening in real time. Aminata had been waiting for 6 months, 23 years old, third in her class at the University of Ouagadougou, and holding an acceptance letter from Stanford University for a doctoral program in public health. The scholarship was full. The research supervisor was renowned. Her thesis proposal had been praised as groundbreaking. All she needed was the visa. She had woken up at 5 that morning to prepare, gone over her documents 3 times, rehearsed her interview answers until the words felt natural. She wore her best blazer, the one she had saved for months to buy, because first impressions mattered, and she stood in that queue with her folder pressed against her chest like a talisman, willing the day to go well. Next to her stood Boubacar, 47 years old, owner of a small textile business in Ouagadougou. He had been invited to a trade expo in Chicago, an opportunity to connect with American buyers who might help him expand beyond West African markets. He had applied for visa renewals before, always nervous, always careful to present himself as someone who would return home. Today was supposed to be routine. When the notice appeared on the screen, Aminata did not understand it at first. Suspended? She turned to Boubacar, confusion written across both their faces. Around them, the queue stirred with uncertainty. People leaned forward, squinting at the screen, as if proximity might change the words displayed there. "Is it a system problem?" someone asked. An embassy staff member, standing behind reinforced glass, offered only the kind of non-answer that bureaucracies give when the truth is too revealing. "Technical adjustments," she said, her voice flat, rehearsed. But people who have spent their lives navigating systems built to deny them know when they are being lied to. By 10 in the morning, confusion had hardened into anger. By 10:30, the queue had begun to break apart. Some people lingered, hoping the suspension was temporary, that normal service would resume by afternoon. Others left immediately, their faces tight with frustration. A few shouted questions at the embassy gates, questions that went unanswered. Aminata stayed the longest. She stood outside those walls, staring at the notice board as if will alone could change what it said. Her folder hung loose in her hand now, the carefully organized documents suddenly meaningless. A journalist approached her, camera in hand, asked how she felt. She looked directly into the lens and said, with a voice that carried both hurt and clarity, "I just wanted to study. What did I do wrong?" The answer, as it turned out, had nothing to do with her. It had nothing to do with Boubacar or the families hoping to visit relatives or any of the individuals whose futures had just been frozen. It had everything to do with what their government had refused to do. By afternoon, the real reason for the suspension had begun to spread through the city. WhatsApp groups buzzed with speculation that hardened into fact. Radio stations interrupted regular programming to discuss it. Television news led with the story. And by the time the sun set over Ouagadougou, everyone knew Burkina Faso had refused a proposal from the United States government, a proposal to accept deportees, people expelled from America under President Donald Trump's intensified immigration crackdown. Washington had framed it as a humanitarian relocation initiative, a partnership to manage migration flows responsibly. But to the government in Ouagadougou, it looked like something else entirely, a demand to turn sovereign soil into a dumping ground for people America no longer wanted. And Burkina Faso had said no. The visa freeze, whether officially acknowledged or not, was the response. A punishment dressed as policy, a message delivered not through diplomatic cables or official statements, but through the sudden, silent closure of opportunity. It was the oldest play in the superpower handbook. Demand compliance, receive refusal, impose consequences. Make an example. Remind the smaller nation of who holds power. Embassies do not shut down over paperwork. They do not suspend visa services because of technical glitches. They shut down over pride, over the perception that respect has been denied, over the calculation that punishment will force reconsideration. For the Burkinabè public, the freeze was more than an inconvenience. It was a revelation. For decades, visas had symbolized opportunity, proof that merit could transcend borders if only the right embassy granted permission. The belief was that if you worked hard enough, studied well enough, presented yourself correctly enough, access would follow. But in one morning, that illusion was shattered. The sudden halt exposed how fragile that access had always been, how conditional, how entirely dependent on the whims and interests of a foreign government. It made people ask a question most governments prefer, remains unasked. If a foreign embassy can close its doors overnight, punishing an entire population for a decision their government made, how much of our mobility is truly ours? The answer was uncomfortable, and it forced a reckoning. But Burkina Faso was no longer a nation that accepted such reckonings quietly, and the man who had taught it to stand was about to explain why. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the heat of the day began to fade, Foreign Minister Karamoko Jean-Marie Traore appeared on national television. The broadcast was unscheduled, interrupting regular programming. The minister sat behind a simple desk, the Burkinabè flag visible over his shoulder. He did not look angry. He did not look defensive. He looked calm, measured, and entirely unmoved by the pressure being applied. His voice, when he spoke, carried the kind of moral clarity that cannot be faked, the clarity of a man who knows he is standing on solid ground. Burkina Faso is not a land of deportation, he began. The words were simple, but they landed like thunder. Our hospitality is not an excuse for others to offload their problems. We welcome those who seek refuge. We open our doors to those fleeing persecution, but we do not accept those expelled as burdens to be managed, as problems to be solved by someone else's decision. He paused, letting the words settle. Sovereignty means the right to say no when our dignity is at stake. It means the right to refuse when a proposal insults the very foundation of what we are building. We are not subordinates, we are partners, and partners negotiate on equal terms. Or they do not negotiate at all. The statement was not anti-American. It was pro-dignity. And across Ouagadougou, across Burkina Faso, across much of Africa, people heard it and recognized something they had not heard enough in their lifetimes. A government that refused to apologize for asserting its own interests. The reaction was immediate. The streets erupted in support. Social media flooded with praise, with people sharing clips of the minister's speech, adding their own commentary. Hashtags trended. Discussions filled radio call-in shows. A university student, interviewed on local radio, said something that would be repeated across the continent. It means we're finally too independent to please them. Even Aminata, standing outside the embassy earlier that day, her visa dreams deferred indefinitely, said this when a journalist found her again that evening. I am upset about my visa. I wanted that scholarship. I wanted that future. But I am proud of my country. For once, we stood up. For once, we did not bend. Her words captured the tension at the heart of the moment. Individual loss, national pride, the cost of dignity, and the refusal to believe that cost was too high. To understand why that refusal carried such weight, why it resonated not just in Burkina Faso but across an entire continent, you have to understand what Burkina Faso has become under Captain Ibrahim Traore. Traore assumed power at the end of 2022. He inherited a nation that was poor, dependent, and suffocating under the weight of foreign extraction. Gold was mined and exported raw, the value captured elsewhere. Agriculture served foreign markets more than domestic needs. Military bases hosted foreign soldiers under the guise of counter-terrorism, a presence that symbolized continued colonial influence long after independence had been declared. A sovereignty that existed on paper but evaporated in practice whenever a powerful nation decided to exert pressure. In less than 3 years, Traore transformed that reality. Not through rhetoric alone, but through action. Deliberate, calculated, and unapologetic action. He reclaimed gold mines, stopped exporting raw ore, and started refining it locally, capturing the value that had always flowed outward. Burkina Faso's gold, processed by Burkinabè workers, sold on terms set by the Burkinabè government. It was a simple shift, but it fundamentally altered the economics of extraction. He rewrote contracts that had favored foreign corporations for decades, renegotiating terms that reflected national interest rather than inherited agreements signed by governments that no longer existed. These were not expropriations. They were renegotiations conducted by a government that refused to accept that old deals were sacred simply because they were old. He expelled French troops, ending Operation Barkhane, and the military presence that had symbolized continued colonial influence. The decision was controversial in Western capitals, but it was celebrated in Ouagadougou. Sovereignty, Traore argued, cannot coexist with foreign soldiers on your soil. He formed the alliance of Sahel states, with Mali, Niger, and Guinea a mutual defense pact and economic cooperation framework that reduced reliance on Western institutions. The alliance was built on the principle that regional security is best managed regionally, that African nations can defend themselves without foreign intervention. And crucially, he removed visa fees for all Africans, a symbolic but powerful gesture that said, "We are building a continent for Africans, not waiting for permission from former colonizers." If a Ghanaian or a Kenyan or a Nigerian wants to visit Burkina Faso, they are welcome. No fees, no barriers. Just recognition that borders drawn by colonial powers should not be walls between African peoples. Every one of these actions was a thread being cut, a string of dependency snipped, a pattern of submission being deliberately, systematically broken. And the pattern Traore was breaking was simple, ancient, and brutally effective. The West demands, Africa complies. For decades, that had been the unspoken rule. Western nations, whether through the IMF, through bilateral agreements, through economic leverage, or through sheer military and diplomatic pressure, made demands. African nations, needing aid, needing investment, needing access to markets, complied, even when compliance cost them dignity, even when it hollowed out sovereignty, even when it meant policies that served foreign interests more than domestic populations. Compliance was survival. Resistance was too expensive. But Traore had decided that survival on those terms was not survival at all. It was a slow death by 1,000 concessions, a future mortgaged for the illusion of present stability, and he was done paying that price. So, when Washington proposed that Burkina Faso accept deportees, people expelled under Trump's immigration crackdown, people with no connection to Burkina Faso, people whose presence would be framed as a burden, the nation was expected to shoulder. It was not just a policy ask. It was a test of whether the old pattern still held, a test of whether Burkina Faso, despite all its recent assertions of sovereignty, would still bend when a superpower applied pressure. The refusal was an answer, a declaration that the pattern had expired, that the era of automatic compliance, of reflexive obedience, was over. And the visa freeze, whether deliberate retaliation or simply the reflexive response of a bureaucracy accustomed to getting its way, proved the point Traore had been making all along. When you stand upright, expect those who are used to your silence to punish you for speaking. At this point, I want to invite you into something bigger than watching. Leave a thank you in the comments. It might be thank you for dignity, or thank you, Burkina Faso, or simply thank you for standing. Why? Because each thank you is an acknowledgement. It says, I see what you are doing, and I honor it. When hundreds of voices join in gratitude, a video becomes a movement. A moment becomes history. So write your thank you now, and let your voice be part of this transformation. But here is what Washington had not anticipated. The punishment only reinforced the transformation. Inside Burkina Faso, the expected panic did not materialize. There were no protests demanding that the government apologize to restore visa services. No editorials calling for pragmatism over pride. No political opposition seizing the moment to criticize Traore for jeopardizing access to American opportunities. Instead, there was something quieter but far more dangerous to the old order: solidarity. The visa freeze, meant to break Burkina Faso's will, instead revealed something Washington had not anticipated. A nation that no longer measured its worth by Western approval. Street vendors discussed it over tea. Good, one of them said, his voice matter of fact. Let them keep their visas. We do not need their permission to prosper. It was not bravado. It was something closer to exhaustion, with a system that had always demanded submission as the price of access. University students organized online, not to protest the freeze, but to celebrate the refusal. One post, shared thousands of times across the continent, read simply, Burkina Faso just showed us the blueprint. The blueprint was this: dignity as political currency. Once you possess it, sanctions lose their leverage. Visa freezes stop being threats and start being irrelevant. Youth across Ouagadougou gathered in cafes, in university common rooms, in public squares, not with anger but with a strange kind of pride. For once, their government had not apologized. For once, their leaders had not scrambled to reassure a foreign power that compliance was coming. For once, they had simply said no and stood by it. But defiance, no matter how morally sound, is only sustainable if it is backed by self-reliance. Ibrahim Traore understood this from the beginning. The refusal to accept deportees was not an isolated act of defiance. It was one piece of a larger strategy. A strategy being built systematically across every sector of national life. The visa freeze exposed a truth that many Africans had always known, but rarely said aloud. Access is only valuable when you have no alternatives. When your economy depends on exporting raw materials to foreign processors, when your food security relies on imported grain, when your youth see no future except through emigration, then a visa freeze is a catastrophe. But when you are building industries at home, when you are processing your own resources, when you are creating opportunities that make staying as attractive as leaving, then a visa freeze becomes something else entirely. An inconvenience, perhaps, but not a crisis. And Burkina Faso was building, deliberately, methodically, with a clear vision of what sovereignty actually requires. Gold was being refined locally now, not exported as raw ore. That single shift captured value that had flowed out of Burkina Faso for generations, turning it into jobs, into government revenue, into leverage in international negotiations. The gold mines that had enriched foreign corporations while leaving local communities poor were now contributing to national wealth in ways they never had before. Rice industries were being developed, reducing dependence on food imports and moving the country towards food self-sufficiency. Burkina Faso grows rice. It always has. But for decades, that rice was sold cheap to regional traders, and processed rice was imported at 10 times the cost. Now, processing plants were being built, mills that could turn local harvests into finished products. Food sovereignty, Traore argued, was the foundation of all other sovereignty. A nation that cannot feed itself cannot be truly independent. Food processing plants were being constructed across the country. Tomatoes grown in Burkinabè soil were being processed into paste, into sauces, into products that had previously been imported. Cashews, Mangoes, shea nuts crops that had always been exported raw were now being processed locally, the value captured at home rather than abroad. Each of these steps was infrastructure. Not infrastructure in the sense of roads and bridges, though those were being built too, but infrastructure in the deeper sense. The scaffolding of independence. The systems that allow a nation to say no without collapsing under the weight of its own courage. And it was working. Burkina Faso's economy, far from crumbling under the pressure of Western disapproval, was stabilizing. Regional trade was growing. The alliance of Sahel states was deepening cooperation, creating supply chains and markets that reduced reliance on European and American buyers. Gold refined in Ouagadougou was being sold to buyers in China, Turkey, India. Rice processed in Bobo Dioulasso was feeding markets in Niger and Mali. The economic geography was shifting, slowly but unmistakably. The diplomatic evolution was even more profound. For decades, Burkina Faso had operated as a satellite, orbiting foreign capitals, Paris, Washington, Brussels. Policy was reactive, shaped by donor demands, by loan conditionalities, by the need to maintain relationships with powers that could cut off aid or access at will. But under Traore, Ouagadougou was positioning itself not as a satellite, but as a gravitational center in West Africa, a place where policy radiated outward rather than being imposed inward. The alliance of Sahel states was the clearest expression of this shift. It was not just a military pact, though mutual defense was part of it. It was an economic and political framework built on the principle that regional problems require regional solutions, that African nations, working together, can provide security, can build infrastructure, can create markets without waiting for permission or assistance from former colonial powers. This was not isolationism. Burkina Faso still traded with Europe, with America, with China. But the terms were different. The posture was different. The willingness to walk away from deals that did not serve national interest was different. And that shift from desperation to negotiation, from dependency to partnership, was revolutionary. Before we continue to the final chapter of this story, which may be the most important of all, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If this channel has moved you, if these stories are touching something deep in your spirit, then consider becoming a member, not for exclusive content or perks, but because supporting this channel is directly supporting narratives that mainstream media refuses to tell. These are stories of sovereignty movements that threaten the narrative of dependency, stories that challenge the structures powerful nations prefer to keep invisible. Bright Star Africa exists to document what others will not cover. Every membership directly funds deeper investigations into African independence movements, into leaders like Ibrahim Traore, who are rewriting the rules. Join us. Stand with the principle that African stories deserve to be told by those who understand what is at stake. 3 weeks after the visa freeze, something unexpected happened. Aminata, the doctoral student whose Stanford dream had been frozen along with embassy services, received an email. She opened it with little hope, probably another rejection, another door closed. But the email was not from Stanford. It was from Cheikh Anta Diop University in Senegal. A full scholarship, a research program in public health, with a supervisor whose work she had read and admired. No visa drama. No waiting in lines outside foreign embassies. Just an offer, extended from one African institution to an African student, based on merit and potential. She stared at the screen for a long time, and then she smiled. Not because the opportunity was better. Stanford's reputation was unmatched, but because for the first time, she realized she had been looking in the wrong direction. Maybe I was looking for validation from the wrong place, she told a friend later that week. Maybe the future I want does not require their permission. Boubacar, the textile business owner, experienced a similar shift. The Chicago Trade Expo had been canceled for him, but in the weeks following the visa freeze, he received inquiries from buyers in Ghana, in Ivory Coast, in Nigeria, regional trade corridors that had always existed but had been underutilized because everyone assumed the real opportunities were in the West. Now, with American access closed, he began exploring what had always been there. Within a month, he had signed deals worth more than the Chicago Expo would have generated, and he realized something that felt both obvious and revolutionary. African markets were growing faster than Western ones. The middle class in Lagos, in Accra, in Nairobi was expanding. They needed textiles, they wanted quality, and they preferred to buy from someone they could meet, whose factory they could visit, whose success felt like their own. This was the pattern emerging across Burkina Faso in the weeks after the freeze. Not collapse, not panic, but redirection. A turning inward and then outward towards partners who had always been there but had been ignored in the rush to please the West. The numbers told the story. Burkina Faso's regional trade increased by 30% in the 3 months following the visa freeze. Not because new industries had been built overnight, but because attention and energy that had been directed towards Western markets were now focused on regional ones. The Alliance of Sahel States intensified cooperation. Gold refined in Ouagadougou was sold to buyers in Turkey and China. Rice processed in Burkina Faso fed markets across West Africa. Food processing plants reduced import dependency, creating jobs and keeping wealth within the country. Each metric was small on its own, but together they told a larger story. The story of an economy that was learning to function without Western approval. The story of a nation that was discovering it had options. Now, let us turn this story into a shared moment. Write in the comments where you are watching from your city, your country, your corner of the world. Bright Star Africa will read them with gratitude, and we send to each of you a heartfelt wish. May your nation never bow for approval it does not need. May your leaders find the courage to stand when standing costs something. This is more than a video. It is a gathering of voices across continents, a reminder that dignity is not a luxury, but a right. But the transformation carried a warning, one that Traore himself had spoken about in speeches, in interviews, in private meetings with regional partners. The warning was this: as Burkina Faso distanced itself from Western institutions, new partnerships were forming. Russia, China, Turkey, all offered cooperation, investment, military support, and while these partnerships brought opportunities, they also brought risks. The risk of replacing one dependency with another, of escaping Western control only to fall into a different kind of subordination. True sovereignty, Traore argued, was not about choosing new masters. It was about staying independent, even among friends. This was the balancing act. Accept partnerships, but not patronage. Trade with all, but be controlled by none. The principle was simple to state, but difficult to practice. Who helps you matters less than who cannot own you. China offered loans for infrastructure. Russia provided military equipment. Turkey proposed joint ventures in agriculture. Each offer came with terms, with expectations, with the subtle pressure that accompanies all relationships between unequal powers. And Burkina Faso's challenge was to take what served its interests while maintaining the independence it had fought so hard to build. Traore understood this. In a speech to the National Assembly, he said, "We are not leaving one orbit to enter another. We are building our own center of gravity." It was a clear articulation of the goal, even if the path remained uncertain. But beyond the geopolitics, beyond the economics, there was a deeper shift happening. A civilizational renewal, as some African intellectuals were calling it. For generations, Africa had been taught to measure progress by how closely it mirrored Europe. Development meant urbanization, industrialization, westernization. Success was defined by donor approval, by World Bank ratings, by the ability to attract foreign investment on terms set by foreign institutions. The colonial century had taught Africa to look outward for validation. The post-colonial decades had reinforced that lesson, wrapping dependency in the language of partnership and development. But now, a new generation of African states, Burkina Faso at the forefront, was measuring progress differently, not by how closely they mirrored the West, but by coherence, by whether policy aligned with purpose, by whether dignity survived success. This shift in measurement was revolutionary because it redefined what leadership meant. In the Western tradition, power is the ability to command, to impose will, to shape the world according to one's interests. But in the African Renaissance now unfolding, power was being redefined as the ability to protect balance, balance between sovereignty and solidarity, between security and humanity, between self-interest and collective good. That is why Foreign Minister Traore's phrase, "We are not a land of deportation," had echoed across the continent, not as a slogan, but as a principle. It told Africans that dignity was not a moral luxury, something to be indulged when times were good and sacrificed when pressure mounted. It was political currency, and once a nation possessed it, loans, sanctions, and summits lost their leverage. But dignity alone is not enough. It must evolve into systems that can sustain it. This was the next phase of Burkina Faso's transformation. The refusal to accept deportees was symbolic. The visa freeze was a test. But the real work was systemic. Burkina Faso's decision to remove visa fees for all Africans was one such system. It was not just a gesture of Pan-African solidarity. It was policy that created free movement, that encouraged regional integration, that treated African citizens as equals rather than as threats to be managed. Investment in regional trade corridors was another. Roads connecting Ouagadougou to Accra, to Abidjan, to Niamey. Infrastructure that made intra-African trade easier, cheaper, more reliable. The creation of markets that reduced dependence on Western buyers. Military self-reliance through the Alliance of Sahel States was a third. Training programs, equipment sharing, joint operations, all designed to prove that regional security could be managed regionally, that African nations could defend themselves without foreign troops on their soil. These were not protests against the world. They were prototypes for a new one, a world where African nations set terms rather than accepting them, where partnership was built on fairness rather than coercion, where sovereignty was not a slogan, but a practice. For the first time in generations, Africa was beginning to write global rules instead of following them. Rules that defined partnership by mutual benefit, migration by consent rather than coercion, cooperation by shared growth rather than extraction. Still, this transformation carried risks. Every movement that breaks chains must guard against forging new ones. As Burkina Faso aligned more closely with Russia, China, and Turkey, it had to remember that dependence wears many flags. That sovereignty is not about who helps you, but about who cannot control you. The philosophical truth at the heart of this entire episode, the visa freeze, the deportation standoff, the defiant speeches was this: freedom is not achieved by fighting for entry. It is achieved by becoming a destination. For decades, African nations had fought for access to Western markets, access to Western universities, access to Western visas. The assumption was that freedom meant being allowed in, being granted permission to participate in systems designed and controlled by others. But Burkina Faso was proving a different principle, that true freedom comes not from being welcomed into someone else's house, but from building your own, from creating opportunities at home that make leaving optional rather than necessary, from developing industries, institutions, and systems that attract rather than expel. Aminata's scholarship to Senegal was a small example of this. She had not fought her way into Stanford. She had been offered a place in an African institution building its own excellence. Boubacar's trade deals in Ghana and Ivory Coast were another. He had not begged for access to American markets. He had found partners in markets that were closer, growing faster, and genuinely interested in mutual success. These were not defeats. They were redirections. And in those redirections lay the seeds of something larger. You are not truly free, the old saying goes, when others stop controlling you. You are free when they start needing you. And that, ultimately, was what Burkina Faso had begun to build. Not just a nation, but an example. A place where refusal became respect, where resistance became order, where Africa finally learned the oldest lesson of power. Sovereignty is not granted. It is claimed, and once claimed, it cannot be taken back. As we prepare to end, remember, this is not just Burkina Faso's story. It is a blueprint. Every closed door is an opportunity to build your own. Every refused visa is a reminder that destination matters more than permission. If you want to follow this journey, if you believe Africa's future will be written by Africans, subscribe to Bright Star Africa. Walk with us as the continent rewrites the rules. Your subscription is not for us alone. It is for every nation learning that dignity is not negotiable, that sovereignty is not optional, and that freedom begins the moment you stop asking for permission. October 10th, 2025. The United States Embassy in Ouagadougou closed its doors. It was meant to teach Burkina Faso a lesson, to remind the nation of who held power, to punish defiance and restore compliance. Instead, Burkina Faso taught the world a different lesson. That sovereignty is not granted by those who once held power over you. That dignity is not a favor to be withdrawn when you displease. That true independence is measured not by who lets you in, but by who cannot keep you out. Sometimes defiance is not rebellion. Sometimes it is just self-respect finally finding its voice. And when that voice speaks, embassies close, but nations rise.